My name is Randy Evans. I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. I want to thank all of you for participating in this session, and I especially want to thank our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to meet with us. The topic for this session is changes in criminal justice procedures. This is part of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track in today's Iowa Ideas Conference. I want to thank Inclusive ICR for its support of this track at this year's conference. Our Cedar Rapids Gazette host, Amy McKelvey, has a brief video to tell you a little bit more about Inclusive ICR.
Hi friends, Angelica Vanetta, co-chair of Inclusive ICR. We are a coalition of over 220 employers in Eastern Iowa, all working together to grow the diversity and inclusion of our workforce, to create a space where employees feel a sense of belonging, included, and valued. Inclusive ICR is a proud sponsor of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track of the Iowa Ideas Conference. As you participate today, be sure to connect with other Inclusive ICR champions, as we'd love to share information with you about our upcoming coalition meetings, projects, and how our work is impacting positive social change in our region. Be sure to check out our website at inclusivicr.org for upcoming events and our e-newsletter. Thank you and have a great conference.
There is much talk today about changes in criminal justice, from the racial and social justice protests across the United States in the wake of George Floyd's murder, to the racial disparities in Iowa's prison population, to calls for criminal justice reforms and changes in police procedures in our state, to racial profiling legislation that went nowhere in the legislature this year, to initiatives that are already underway in some communities to address these issues. There have been incidents in Des Moines and Cedar Rapids and Iowa City involving police and protesters. There have been noteworthy settlements related to actions of police officers in some communities. And there are studies that about the racial gap in Iowa's arrests and prison populations. We have three exceptional panelists with us today. Be thinking of the questions you have for them. You can submit them to Amy using the chat feature in Zoom. I will introduce each of our panelists and then ask each one to briefly tell you a little bit more about them and their work and how it intersects with the topic that we're discussing today. Our panelists are Betty Andrews, the Iowa-Nebraska president of the NAACP. We're stealing Betty from a meeting with Iowa's court judges, and she will be joining us shortly. Pete McRoberts is the policy director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Iowa, and he works on behalf of the ACLU in the Iowa Legislature. And our third panelist is Tahir Duckett, who leads efforts at Georgetown University to work in conjunction with police agencies around the United States to bring a new vision to community safety and policing. Tahir, why don't you get us started by telling us a bit more about your work and some of your thoughts on kind of the push-pull over changes in policing and criminal justice in America?
Certainly, not a small question at all, but I'm happy to get us started. And thank you for having us. Thank you to all of our incredible hosts, and to all the participants who have logged in to join this conversation. It's a critical one facing the country, and I think that it requires all of us to really look closely at what's happening in our cities and in our neighborhoods. So my name is Tahir Duckett. I'm the executive director of the Center for Innovations in Community Safety at Georgetown University Law Center. And we are an academic center that is focused on building a new vision for community safety. We have deep expertise in policing, in the criminal system generally. And what we've been doing is focusing on what it actually looks like to have safe neighborhoods in a modern society. And I think that, we focused really on innovations because for too long, we simply relied on assumptions in terms of what makes a society safe. We've thought that, if we, just hire enough police officers, then that will fix all of our problems. If we ask police officers to do everything, then that will solve our problems. And I think that, increasingly people have been looking around in the last few years and recognizing that it's not sufficient, right? It's not sufficient because there are problems within policing that need to be fixed. And it's not sufficient because we've been giving too much to police to do in our society more broadly. We should be focusing on as well on other alternatives to relying on police to keep our neighborhoods safe. And so our program takes several approaches to dealing with this problem. First, we do deep work on transforming police agencies and departments across the country. We've done that most primarily through two programs. One is Police for Tomorrow Fellowship Program, where we work with relatively new cadets and try to build a deeper sense of their place in the world as police officers, more than they might get from the police academy. We talk to them about other alternative approaches to community safety, like violence interruption. We talk to them about officer wellness and mental health, and try to engage with them around reducing the truly awful rates of depression and mental health problems among law enforcement officers. We talk to them about adolescent brain development, so they understand what it actually means for when a 14-year-old that they are, trying to talk to about some graffiti talks back to them or something like that. So it is a one-year program that has really seen some incredible results in terms of building up officers into leadership who have a broader sense about their place in the world. And then our other program is our ABLE project. We call it active. It's the Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement program. And that project is designed to help agencies build a culture of bystander intervention amongst their officers. And that bystander intervention is designed to reduce officer misconduct, reduce officer mistakes, and also promote officer health and safety and wellness. And that's a program that has been really successful and really popular. It's been adopted thus far by over 180 agencies across the nation over the course of just the last year. That 180 agencies, or those 180 agencies serve over 62 million Americans. And so it is a program that has been well received by law enforcement, which makes it a little bit unique in the realm of some of the police reforms that are being proposed and are being discussed today. And then the last thing that I'll mention that we work on are focusing on new initiatives and new approaches to community safety, right? So, researching and evaluating and offering policy solutions around interventions and policy initiatives that maybe we haven't always thought about as being part of our approach to public safety, our approach to reducing crime. thinking about housing interventions, thinking about mental health interventions, thinking about what is the role of first responders, what should they be trained to do, what should they know how to do, what should be their powers, those sorts of things. And so we also do a lot of deep research and policy recommendations in those areas as well.
Thank you, Tahir. Pete, I would like to turn to you now. If you could tell us more about your work and the ACLU's work in this criminal justice area and your thoughts on the changes in policing and criminal justice that you see occurring or not occurring.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. We sure appreciate it. The ACLU is Iowa's largest civil rights and civil liberties organization as a law office. And we work very closely with other civil rights organizations in the state, such as the NAACP, but primarily our chief responsibility is to the people, whether that's with lawsuits or whether that's changing the laws, whether that's working with municipalities and localities to change their local ordinances. And we all do this for kind of I want to illustrate why. If you ever go to the Supreme Court and you look at the west front of it, you can see right above the entrance is the phrase equal justice under law. And that correctly tells everybody that justice is a process, and justice can be applied to different people in different ways based upon the decisions of what people in power do. So everything we do can be summed up by advocacy, whether it's in the courtroom, the legislature, and city councils, under the idea of making the justice system more and more equal for people until they are truly equally protected under the law. And so I'm primarily a legislative attorney here. We work with the General Assembly. I've done this in some respect and some capacity for several years. And as everybody understands, the criminal justice reform is a very, very broad thing. And I had some remarks prepared, but I want to jump off from what Tahir talked about to contextualize public safety in a very real world sense, as an example of not only what the ACLU does, I can talk about that all day, but about how reforms are necessary at the local level and how they can be done. So Tahir mentioned public safety, law enforcement, criminal justice, and and racial disparities and racial justice. Those things aren't all the same, but they often fit very closely together. And a great example of identifying a problem and then taking some steps to fix it happened in Cedar Rapids. And this is something I hadn't thought to talk about earlier, but just imagine if you were a survivor of domestic violence. Imagine if you were in your own home and you had been hurt. Somebody violated the law to hurt you, and you were in danger of losing your home simply because you called the police. That happened all over the country. It still is, but it happens very, very regularly when local ordinances require what's called a nuisance ordinance or a specific crime ordinance, and it has the effect of penalizing people for being victimized. This is clearly unfair. Nobody would choose this, but this is the thing that developed. And so several years ago, we had an issue with Cedar Rapids where this was happening on a regular basis, and we had to change the state law in order to outlaw that practice. This was a huge national issue. There was a famous case, I believe it was in New Jersey, where a woman had been just brutalized at home, called the police for help. The police came, helped her. She committed no crime. She lost her home as a result. That's the stuff that happened when laws and public policy are either badly written or they're unfairly enforced. So when we talk about public safety reform, when we talk about policing, it's not just simply, we'll change the law, we will address one specific issue. We got to address all of them. Otherwise, people get hurt. In the case of Iowa and Cedar Rapids specifically, people were being just brutalized once by their attacker, and then by the fact that they were losing their house on account of a city ordinance. So the ACLU worked with the NAACP, with the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, with the property owners in order to outlaw that practice in the state. That was great progress. It doesn't solve everything, but this is the point. I hope we could all agree that even though we want full, complete reform, you can't do things necessarily overnight, but increments in the right direction are positive and they are progress. So even with all of the difficulties that happen in communities all over the state, one simple statutory change, one change in practices, that can help a lot of people. And so, the saying, the ocean is so great, but my boat is so small. Well, you know what? If we do these things every day with a focus on people, with a focus on equality under law, then I think we can get to a point where if a crime victim needs help, and historically that neighborhood or people with that racial background or gender background are underserved, they can get the help that they need. We can get rid of laws and ordinances that target people and victimize them twice. That's a very, very localized version, because ultimately, for example, in the state of Iowa, there's 1,000 governments, whether it's a municipality or a county or the state. And each one of those governments has their power to either interfere with somebody's civil rights and liberties or to protect them. And so our job is to hopefully give them an on-ramp to protect people's rights through model statutes, through cajoling them, hectoring them, pressuring them, organizing, or alternatively, just beat them. And sometimes that has to happen. But we believe that there is a role for everybody to play in protecting civil rights and civil liberties in the communities. And that's our fundamental goal. It's going back to equal justice under law. It's a long process. It will never end, but nobody has the right to sit silent. Everybody has to do what they can, but everybody gets to. We all have the opportunity to make our governments more and more responsive to people who have historically been underserved or worse, targeted by government power. And that's our job.
Thank you, Pete. I believe our third panelist, Betty Andrews, has joined us now. Betty is a longtime leader of the NAACP in Iowa and Nebraska. Betty, could you please tell us more about the NAACP's work in this whole area of criminal justice and policing reform, and offer your initial thoughts on this important topic?
Sure. Thanks so much, Randy. It is my pleasure to be with you. And I do want to say I apologize for being a little tardy this afternoon. I actually am coming from another presentation where we presented to about 200 judges from all across the state of Iowa. And as a matter of fact, our legal redress co-chairs are continuing on with that presentation. And that's just kind of one of the examples of the things that we do. The mission of the NAACP is to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights for all citizens, and particularly minority citizens of the United States. We do that by working to eliminate race-based prejudice, racial hatred, and racial discrimination. We do this work by working through what we call our game changers, and those are in relationship to our mission: education, economic sustainability, health, voting rights, political action, public safety, and criminal justice, and then of course, youth engagement. So the NAACP has been around since 1909. So that's about 112 years of history when it comes to championing civil rights. And I just want to say that one of it, I have some of my NAACP colleagues that often encourage me that when I'm speaking to say one of our more popular statements from the NAACP, that we are the largest and the boldest, the baddest and the oldest civil rights organization. We are the most discussed and the most cussed. We are the big dog. We are the baddest civil rights organization. Now, I say that in jest because I work a lot with our colleagues at the ACLU, and quite frankly, the NAACP works with anyone who is seeking justice. We seek justice. If you want to sum up what the NAACP does, that's what we do. We seek justice. And in seeking that justice, and I'm sure that Pete, you've probably heard the story quite a bit. we have found out that several years ago about the over-incarceration of African Americans in our criminal justice system. At that time, our Iowa ranked #1 in the nation for over-incarcerating African Americans. That number was for every one white person per capita, it was 14 African Americans per capita. And for me personally, that was a crisis. That was a personal shock to my system, and it compelled me into action. And one of the things that I have done that the NAACP continues to sponsor is we started the Iowa Summit on Justice and Disparities, which is an an event that addresses these disparities. We pull together all of the pieces from the judicial branch, from the executive branch, from local people from across the state that come together, the legislative branch come together and talk about criminal justice reform. Through our work, we have been able, and working again with the ACLU and many others, to bring forward the signing of Executive Order number 7 that allowed those with felony background the right to vote. And many people think that the work stops there, but what people don't know is that this work is not necessarily kind of always it often is out in the streets, saying, making statements and things like that, but it's much more than that. It's behind the scenes. And so with Executive Order number 7, which was so important for the voting rights for people with felonies. And I might add that this was the second time that an executive order like that was signed. And the first time it was signed, the NAACP was a part of that work as well. But in addition to that, we worked with the Iowa Supreme Court to get a supervisory order from the courts that allowed people who received their voting rights back under Executive Order number 7 to also be allowed to serve, or let them get to serve on juries in our state. The NAACP also worked with the Secretary of State's office to ensure that the voting process was fair and welcoming. In addition to that, we continue to educate people and our citizens around this. We have worked on several justice laws. We have worked with our whatever sitting governor that's been present. We've been successful in getting a couple of criminal justice reform committees that from those committees, several laws have been passed on criminal justice reform, including the reduction of crack cocaine, the sentencing for that, and a number of other sentencing reform issues. And, there are just, in the spirit of the Black church, the NAACP, I'm very proud to say in working with the NAACP that we have done so much. We cannot tell it all, but we certainly are appreciative to be here and talk a little bit about that. Of course, with the NAACP, one of our major issues is racial profiling and getting legislation. That is a work that we brought to the state and worked with several organizations to collaborate around. We, in this last iteration of the Governor's Criminal Justice Committee, we made several recommendations. They have been up for legislation quite a couple of times at least, and unfortunately have not been passed. However, we have successfully worked with groups around the state and gotten several local ordinances, local racial profiling ordinances passed, or anti-racial profiling ordinances passed. So that's just a little bit of the work, but as I said before, I cannot tell it all. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Betty. It seems that, when we get into a discussion of disparities in arrests, incarceration numbers, people seem to separate into two camps. one camp is we have too many people committing too many crimes. And, the line you will hear from people is, well, I'm not concerned about that because I don't commit crimes. How do you help the public understand the significance of this disparity? Tahir, why don't you take it first, and we'll go around the horn here.
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed me smile when you said that people, that there are some people who think that they don't commit crimes. It's not super likely, right? Our criminal code, both federally and in every state across the nation, is incredibly deep and detailed, and kind of famously, what you hear a lot of people say in any criminal law class that you take is that if you hop into a car and you drive down the street, it's hard to go more than 200 yards without committing some sort of traffic infraction because of how many there are on the books. And I think that folks need to realize that a big part of what we have done with policing and with policing in particular is allowed just an extraordinary amount of discretion in terms of when police officers choose to enforce these laws, right? Whether they be, if you've ever jaywalked, then then you've committed a crime, and one that the Supreme Court has held that you could be arrested for and spend a night in jail for, even if that might not be the even if it turns out that's not actually the what the local law provides for. And so it's important to recognize that that discretion means that for any of us any day, we could find ourselves exposed to the power of the state or the power of police officers. And I think that that's a useful way of thinking about the sort of empathy that we need to have for folks who are in neighborhoods where they get exposed to that kind of power and that kind of that kind of experience with the state from day to day. I think the other thing is this, it may be that you haven't committed a crime, but it doesn't require you having committed a crime in order for you to come into close contact with the state, right? It doesn't require you to have committed a crime for an officer to stop you and frisk you, or to all that's required is some reasonable suspicion from the officer. And that, again, because of the amount of discretion that we've given to police officers, that can be anything from the neighborhood that you're walking in to, the kind of clothes that you're wearing, or even the gait that you're using when you walk down the street. And, I think that for most people, and I think especially for most white folks, they live in neighborhoods where they don't necessarily experience that side of policing from day to day. They aren't necessarily exposed to the fact that you might be stopped by a police officer for, while you're walking down the street, on your way to your job, or on the way to school, or on the way home from school, and, bothered and harassed. And what that feels like from day to day, month to month, and year to year. And I can speak from my own experience like this. I grew up in Georgia, and I remember I used to get pulled over 4 or 5 times a year. Not for any particular thing. The thing that I kind of most often got cited for was for drifting, and that's where you're the tire touches, the dashes on the middle of the road or on the side of the road, get pulled over, and they asked to search my car, and they asked me to get out of the car and get patted down. And, that leaves folks with a taste in their mouth when it comes to how they feel about policing, or it can leave folks with a sort of taste in their mouth. And so, I say all of that just to make sure that folks recognize that each of our individual experiences with policing is not what everybody else is experiencing when it comes to policing. And I think that some of that you started to see last year when there were protests across the nation, but then you also saw a lot of the police violence in response to those protests. I think that that was a moment where a lot of folks started to wake up and recognize, okay, maybe there's a deeper problem here than we expected, and maybe we need to take the fact that this is happening not just in this city or in this isolated incident or in this other isolated incident, that maybe the problem is a little bit deeper than thinking about an individual bad apple or something like that. And a lot of people, I always laugh a little bit because people say, okay, well, let's just get rid of the bad apples, but folks forget that the rest of that idiom is that one bad apple spoils the bunch, right? And so, it's not just that you have to get rid of that bad apple, but you also do have to kind of recognize that there can be a spoil the bunch effect there. And that's a big part of why we focus so much on our bystander intervention program, right? Because when there are good apples, we have to do a lot better job of empowering them to speak up, to do something, to say something, to, tell Derek Chauvin to get his knee off of George Floyd's neck, that those officers have to feel empowered. And the reality is, our experience and our expertise tells us that in a lot of places, due to general cultural issues as well as rank, that a lot of officers don't feel empowered to step up and speak out when they see their officers, their fellow officers may be engaged in doing something that's a mistake or engaged in some kind of misconduct.
Thank you, Tahir. Your mention of Derek Chauvin leads me to draw a contrast between the events that played out after George Floyd's death in Minneapolis and what plays out fairly routinely in Iowa. I've spent 50 years as a journalist and as an advocate for government transparency, talking about the importance of the public having access to information about what is going on with their government. In Derek Chauvin's case, within days of George Floyd's death, the citizens of Minneapolis knew, because of access to discipline records, how many complaints had been filed against Derek Chauvin, the outcome of those disciplinary procedures. In Iowa, in contrast, those records are all secret unless they come out as part of a lawsuit. Do the people of Iowa deserve to know more about how our police officers are disciplined and when they are or when they aren't? Can we really expect society to have trust and confidence in our police if government officials keep police discipline files secret, especially when we give officers weapons and the authority to use deadly force? Betty, what thoughts do you have there?
Thank you. So if I could, I was prepared to answer the question you had for Tahir, and I appreciated his comments, and actually the same points kind of jumped in my head when the question was asked. So if you don't mind, I'll start with that, and I'm going to ask you to give me that last question again. I wanted to talk just to as it relates to Iowa, really emphasize this piece that Tahir brought up about discretion. And That's really key because discretion is a big part of this. And I know we've all heard the line, if you don't want to do the time, don't do the crime. And the reality is that that really does look different if you follow the process for people of color, and in particular, the African-American community at every level where there are decision points. And so not only when the officer approaches and decides whether or not they should be charged, if you back that up, that decision as to where to put police officers in neighborhoods, as Tahir mentioned, many reasons, or many of the reasons why people are not caught is because there are no police officers there to see what they're doing. And so that goes into that discretion in terms of whether or not they are charged. The prosecutor, what level of charges they make for different people. And it looks different based on skin color. And it's one reason African Americans are often charged at a higher level for the same crime. And what usually happens is that they plead down to the next level crime. So they, whereas, and not only that, dealing with financial burden. Obviously, there is a wage gap and a wealth gap. And so who gets an attorney that they pay for and who gets a public defender, those factor in. So when they now plea at that level, they are serving versus someone being charged at a lower level and then getting an attorney to address that lower level and then getting off. So that affects the disparities. Deferment programs, whether or not they get deferment programs, sentencing, how long the sentences are, how harsh the sentences are. Those are all places where there is human discretion. So from the chiefs putting them wherever they're deciding to put them, for the officers making the charges, for the prosecutors, which charges to make or not to defer, and then the judges making the sentencing. So it really is a tough hill to climb when it comes to asking the question or dealing with why there's such a difference. And I will point out, I mentioned Iowa's numbers, and I know that we're number 3 at this point with that incarceration number. But we're also number 1 when it comes to juvenile incarceration and juvenile pushing African-American juveniles to adult court. I will point out that in that realm, in terms of the discretion, it affects more than just that individual. It affects families, and it becomes a cycle, and it is certainly a challenge. Now, you asked another question. Did you want me to answer that, or do you want me to defer to Pete?
Oh, no, well, go ahead. I mean, do we run the risk with keeping police discipline secret? Do we run the risk of eroding public confidence in the police to police themselves?
Well, we certainly do. And I know that there is a lot of discussion with whether or not things are human resource problems versus problems that are dealing with the community. I know in Des Moines, we have had several times where we've had a number of payouts. There are situations right now where there's a sexual scandal or within the Des Moines police. So we definitely run the risk by not being transparent. And that's certainly why you see, I know in the Des Moines area, and also, quite frankly, I've seen it in Cedar Rapids and other places, a lot of people showing up at the city council meetings asking for that transparency. And, even thinking about qualified immunity, that is also a way of shielding police from transparency. And so we say that a badge should never be a shield to accountability. So absolutely, we lie on the side of transparency and making sure that, we hold police officers to a higher level of accountability in the sense of they carry a gun and they are making individual discretionary decisions that could harm people. And so we really do need to look at that.
You spend a lot of time in the legislature. What are the chances, in your honest opinion, do you think, for the legislature to provide more openness and transparency to these disciplinary procedures and cases? Because as Betty alluded to, as a taxpayer of Des Moines, I've paid out in the hundreds of thousands of dollars cases where police officers have handcuffed an individual who may have broken the law or may not, but handcuffed the person behind his back, picked him up while he's prone, picked him up, one officer on each side, and then just let him fall 2 to 3 feet onto the pavement with no means of protecting his face. Is there any hope of bringing about change in the legislature?
Yeah, I'll hit that first point quickly, and I want to add to a question of transparency. So, as Betty talked about, with regard to a lot of things, there's been real progress, and I don't mean to shine too bright a light or sound too much like a Pollyanna, but the reality of it is, the legislative environment is different, and I believe a little more favorable than it was. Betty, for example, when you and I started working on this, there's positive steps with regard to expungement of offenses. The people who are in charge right now have been in charge for 5 years, so everything is on them. So in terms of the trajectory that we're on, when I started, which is remarkably long ago, all things considered, even something like a body camera, the presence of it was very controversial. And now I think, generally speaking, there's an understanding that type of transparency is a win-win. I was an old public defender. I could, in a setting like that, I would have loved to have a body camera, either to show that the offense happened, or to show that my client was correct. I mean, the truth there, the transparency benefits. So with regard to police practices reform, I think we are closer to the idea that the more transparency there are, frankly, if you're making an unfair complaint against a police department, your records will show it, your body cams will show it. If an officer behaved badly and needs to be sanctioned for it, the records will show it, the camera will show it. So yeah, I think there's getting close to a consensus on that transparency actually really benefits both sides of the equation, whether it's the officer, whether it's the person who's arrested, and ultimately it better informs policymakers. So you know how skeptical we at the ACLU are of government generally, but in terms of seeing things for what they are, I believe that the trajectory is moving in the right direction at the legislature. Always tough. It's always tough. But if you've been there, as Betty and I have for a while, Randy, I've seen you up there from time to time, I bet. The trajectory seems to be moving in a proper direction. It's not easy. It's not easy at all. I don't mean to imply that people are just waiting in order to solve the problem, but there's a window that has not been the case for a while. Second piece of transparency relates not to the law, but to the application of the law in communities and in courtrooms. So Betty mentioned the disparity. I'm going to tell an anecdote here, but I think it really shows the point, which is very true. When I was a defense attorney, which I hated, I was a public defender, couldn't stand it, but everybody has to go through that trench. In one day, I watched the same judge and the same prosecutor address the same offense, first offense, to similarly situated people. And the only difference was that one of the couples was white and the other couple was black. And in a span of 4 hours, you could see the difference in the deal being offered. You could see a difference between what was being offered in terms of release and the release of a restraining order. And I was a new lawyer at that time, and it just blew my mind. I mean, this is what you hear about, but when you see it up front, and listen, it bothered me, and I don't even have to live it. Like Tahir said, I can't live that experience. I'm a middle-aged white lawyer, but we all have to look for these things and we all have to see them. Otherwise, we're going to assume that the process works as it's supposed to be. We're going to assume that minor offenses do not ruin somebody's lives. We're going to assume that discretion will be used for the proper reasons. So let's dig in. Let's dig into the courtrooms. Let's see what happens when DAJs run through many, many, many minor offenses in a day. Let's see where there's room for improvement there. Second, just in terms of regular processes, let me give a very local example. When we talk about the disparity and people getting arrested at a young age, we don't really have to look any further than Cedar Rapids itself. I mean, so for example, just in this last week, the Cedar Rapids City Council unanimously voted on an issue regarding armed police in schools, which will now be expanded into elementary schools. 2 weeks ago, the Cedar Rapids School Board did the very same thing. And if all you did was listen to what was said publicly, what the elected officials are saying, you would think that this is nothing more than a great way to put role models in schools, to keep hallways safe. But let's boil that down to what it means. There's thousands of school kids in Cedar Rapids. No other entity where people congregate has a full-time police presence. Not a nursing home, not a factory, not a shopping mall, none of this stuff. But somehow we've decided that a school is this bastion of violent activity that requires full-time armed police with arrest authority and with the authority to use physical force if necessary. This doesn't mean that the police there have improper motives. I've heard them speak. I don't think they do. I think they're genuine. What I'm saying is the thing doesn't work. So let's bear this out to Betty's point. In Cedar Rapids specifically, 61.2% of referrals in juvenile complaints, so Betty's point, to juvenile justice, 61.2% of those complaints were with Black kids. And they only make up less than 20% of the population of the children in Cedar Rapids schools. And that is what our government officials, the city council and the school board just endorsed. That is a thing that requires transparency. So on one hand, legal transparency for personnel records, for abuses, for things that exonerate people when complaints are unfair, absolutely. The other half of transparency is we got to look under the hood to see what our local governments are doing that create that school to prison pipeline and the juvenile justice failure that's happening for kids of color in the state of Iowa. And it's interesting, we're talking a lot about the racial component because we should. That's a huge problem in Iowa. But once we see a little bit what's happening, that transparency really opens our eyes, because another group of children who were so dramatically affected by full-time armed police in schools are kids with disabilities. So from my perspective as a middle-aged, white lawyer who doesn't live either of those experiences, I bet I could look at that on paper and think, okay, good. This is role modeling. This takes care of a problem if somebody brings drugs to school, which happen, or if there's violence. But to Tahir's point, illegal activity occurs all the time. 2 kids get into a fight in a lunchroom, which has happened since time immemorial. That is legal assault in Iowa. Do they need to be arrested for it? Absolutely not. But in Cedar Rapids specifically, I encourage people to look internally and see what that means. So just like the law can protect transparency and in turn protect people's rights and liberties and make for a more fair and just frankly better educated process, people have to do the same thing. We are individually accountable for getting under the hood and making sure that these bad decisions are not made and ratified as though they're filling potholes. These are decisions that are hurting children, and there's a way out of them. 7 police officers in Cedar Rapids are responsible for that issue of the 61% of the kids being referred to for juvenile complaints. They should be in communities responding to things that only police can respond to. That's the deal there. When you take somebody whose intentions are great, but their job is to arrest, interrogate, and use force if necessary, they need to go where only they can go. They don't need to be in schools. And I think your city council and your school board can fix that error immediately and create a tiny ripple of hope inside the community, which will help kids and increase transparency of what's factually happening in society.
Thank you, Pete. We're down to less than 10 minutes. One of the purposes of Iowa Ideas is to focus on solutions. So I would like to give each of you the chance to share with the audience what are some of the most effective changes that you think ought to be made in our communities in Iowa to address the issue of disparities in criminal justice and policing. Pete, I'll give you a chance to cool off first before I come to you. Tahir, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, I look, I'm not from Iowa, so I'm not going to tell y'all exactly what y'all need in Iowa. Y'all know a whole lot better than me. But let me offer you this. What I think is one of the most important changes that can be made is, for folks that are on this call, for folks that I think that changing this sort of a system that is built in and is ingrained and has been operating on cruise control for, obviously for hundreds of years, that just requires people to say, no, actually, I don't want it, right? Because, the biggest sort of indictment of our current system, or the biggest way in which our current system, I suppose I should say, indicts us, is that it's one that we've allowed to happen, right? It's one that we, in some cases explicitly asked for, that we wanted, more police as a response to everything. We wanted more incarceration as a response to everything. We operated from a place of fear and thought that, the best way to fight crime is to lock people up and throw away the key. And, now we have decades of evidence that show why that's not the case. And so we have to demand something different. And, our politicians are going to be the last folks to the table on this, right? They are, by and large, not going to be the folks who lead. They're going to be the ones who follow. And they're going to be following because people like you are calling them and saying, look, I don't want police officers in my schools anymore. Okay, that's not the solution for us. And Pete, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it's a perfect example of one of the first things that I thought that I talked about today, where we've looked to policing as a way to fix every kind of problem in the world imaginable under the sun. I remember my school resource officer, they wanted him to be a mentor, right? They were like, well, we need, this is useful because it's a mentor. And I was like, there are hundreds of teachers here. Like, there's guidance counselors, there's all these other people that could be mentors. It doesn't have to be somebody with a gun. And so, my point is just that, this isn't a system that is going to change just because, we tweet about it, or because, somebody writes an op-ed, or even just through the marches in the streets, right? It requires, calls and showing up and testifying at city council meetings. It's not a problem that's going to be solved at the federal level. It's a problem that's going to be solved in cities and states. And so, my biggest, sort of call for change that I'm going to ask for is just for y'all to be, really active on this kind of thing, because I guarantee you there are also people who aren't thinking about this, or who have been, who are just thinking about it in the same way that we've always thought about it for the last couple of decades, and who do think that, there's been some fights at schools. We need police officers in schools to deal with that sort of thing. And they're making their voice heard. And if that's not something that you're on board with, you got to do the same.
Thank you. Betty?
Yeah, I will echo everything that my colleagues on the panel have said. And I would also just like to offer just a quick listing, just because I know we're tight on time, but we definitely need to diversify juries. So jury reform, we need to enact racial profiling, anti-racial profiling legislation. We do need to address the school to prison pipeline. We also need to address the DHS to prison pipeline. Those disparities walk in lockstep. We also need to address court fines and fees. Many people are augured back into the criminal justice system for various reasons. They may take a public defender and find out that in the end they have to pay for it. That pulls them back into the system. In our state, we have a minority impact law. We need to put teeth into that law so that legislators can't ignore what has happened. And I will leave it at there and just remind everyone that they need to do magic. And action is magic, because magic is simply you do something happens and change happens. So I encourage people to make magic by taking action.
Thank you, Betty. Pete, you get the last word here. What are the things that you think need to be dealt with right away to make headway?
Well, thank you. And for the first time in my life, I'll keep this short. I'm going to associate myself with Tahir and with Betty in terms of programmatic things. But where I started, I've mentioned that we do a lot of legislative policy. We're a small shop. And like Tahir said, like Betty said, this happens when people engage. And so where I want to leave it is for people. If you're watching this and you see a problem that you want to fix, or if you've got an idea that you think might turn into an ordinance or a law, I mean, number one, you do it. Just do it. Get there. You don't have to be perfect, but when you're talking to elected officials, they will see you as the expert. I want to leave on a high note only because I've been involved with this. I've counted it out. I believe this is my 25th year of public policy here. It would be easy for somebody watching all this stuff there with what doesn't get done to be cynical, but I'll tell you, I believe that most of the people who are making those final decisions have good intentions. I really do. And so all we have to do is educate them. And if you approach legislative work, public policy work, federal, state, or otherwise, with the assumption that they probably mean well, even if you disagree with their judgment, even if it's caused problems, they mean well, you work with them, and that is how you create an on-ramp for some of these legal changes. So everything we talked about, none of it happens unless somebody chooses that it happens. None of it happens unless somebody with authority decides, that's where I'm going to take this. So be there with them, educate them. They will rely on you. That doesn't mean give them a break. It doesn't mean change your ideals. But if you've got strong ideals, these folks do too, let them know what it is. But educate them. Be their on-ramp to the policy that we seek. They will listen.
I'm sorry. And Randy, I just wanted to quickly say, in the spirit of education, the Iowa Summit on Justice and Disparities is coming up on December the 7th. And Tahir, I know you're at Georgetown. You mentioned the bystander program. That was a featured presentation at the summit last year. I just want to encourage everyone, everything we've talked about, and then some will be covered in several workshops on December 7th. So just encourage everyone to Google us and get on, join us for that event.
Thank you, Betty. I want to thank our three panelists today, Pete, Tahir, Betty, for taking time out. It's been a very stimulating discussion. I want to thank the Gazette for organizing this, and I want to thank all of our attendees for taking time. There's plenty of sessions left today, so I will let you pick and choose and decide where you're going next. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks, everyone.